The wind on the steppe didn't blow. It carved. It cut through wool and leather, through skin and will, until a man felt hollowed out and left to rattle. Somewhere in that endless white walked a German soldier with a torn greatcoat and boots wrapped in rags, one hand on a stick, the other tucked under his arm to keep the fingers from freezing. He did not think of distances anymore, only of the next footprint he could place before the snow swallowed the last. His name, let's call him Eric, had been shouted 1,000 times since 1941. In barracks, on roll calls, in hospital tents where morphine was a rumor. He had crossed the border with the invasion of the Soviet Union, convinced the war would be quick. Instead, he learned the truth of winter and of hunger and of the sound a man makes when he realizes he will not see spring. Stalingrad was not his battle, but its shadow reached him all the same. By 1944, the front was moving west like a tide. Orders were the same everywhere. Hold, hold, hold. Then the line broke and held no more. Capture was not a single moment for Eric. It was a series of small surrenders. First, the truck stopped coming. Then the bread. Then the officer who said the division would regroup simply did not return. In a birch grove lit by tracer fire, he dropped his last full magazine and lifted his hands. The Red Army patrol looked at him as if he were an animal that had finally decided to lie down. They took his papers, his watch, his belt knife, and marched him east. Transport meant cattle cars, 40 men to a box, a bucket in the corner, frost on the nails, breath turning to crystals. He learned the geography of cold by the sounds the wheels made, howls over river bridges, whispers across open plain, a hammering when the rails buckled under ice. When the train door did open, they opened to a slice of sky so pale it seemed already dead. He saw signs he could not read. He saw villages made of smoke and wood and eyes. And then the train went on. The camp had a name, but the men used a number. Numbers were simpler to forget. A wooden gate, a portrait of Lenin, guards with fur caps, and faces you could not hate because hate required energy. Barracks smelled of wet straw and old soup. Rations were a ladle and a memory. He learned to tie his scarf over his mouth, not for warmth, but so that the steam of his breath would not freeze his lips shut. Work began in the dark and ended in the dark, felling trees, hauling logs, digging pits that filled with snow as fast as they were dug. The overseer's commands were predictable. Bestray. Davai. The body responded the way a stubborn animal does, by doing exactly as much as it must to keep from being beaten. Men made rules to stay alive. Never eat snow. It steals heat. Keep your socks under your shirt at night so they dry against your skin. Trade what you can. A button for a spoon for a stitch of tobacco, tobacco for one more sip of soup. Eric learned Russian words the same way he learned to saw wood, by repetition that left blisters. Chleb for bread, teplo for warmth, dom for home, a word that sounded heavy in the mouth. At night they told stories. The Russians told of summers where the river ran like silver and the fish were so many you could catch them with a bucket. The Poles listed cities alphabetically, as if order could make them real again. The Germans spoke in the future tense. When I get back, when this is over. The talk itself was rationed. It kept a man from slipping beneath the ice of silence. Winter gave way to another winter without much evidence of a summer between. Eric watched strong men shrink to the size of their bones. He learned to read the cough that meant a lung had given up. He saw two prisoners fight over a crust and then weep into the same palm. He saw a guard leave a piece of bread on a fence post and pretend not to see who took it. He learned that mercy exists even where it is not allowed. He also learned a plan, not an escape. Those were fairy tales told by men who froze 10 steps from the wire, but a return, a walk that would be measured in months, then seasons. He began by collecting facts: which direction the sun rose behind the barracks, where the supply sleds came from, which rivers were frozen clean, and which held black water under white crust. He befriended a Latvian carpenter with a map drawn on cloth. The ink faded where sweat had worn it. He traded 2 buttons and a story for a chance to copy it with soot and fat onto a strip of linen cut from his undershirt. What pushes a man from survival to escape is rarely noble. For Eric, it was a letter. It found him late in 1946, carried by a guard who read the return address as if the name might burn his tongue. The handwriting was his mother's, disciplined and slanted. It spoke of a roof, patched, and a garden that had learned grief. It spoke of a brother not returned. And at the end, a line as practical as it was impossible: "Come home before the trees bloom." That night Eric did not sleep. He laid the letter flat and traced the grooves the pen had cut. He held it to his face to smell a house he could not remember clearly. In the morning, he knew the shape of his future: a line drawn west, over rivers and roads he had never seen, through forests where the wolves understood hunger better than men. He would walk until the language turned familiar, until church bells sounded like the ones in his head, until the mud tasted of the Rhine. He did not know how many steps that meant, only that standing still now felt like betrayal. In the camp yard, the wind found the gap between collar and skin and taught him its old lesson. He looked at the fence. He looked at the sky. He folded the letter once, twice, 3 times, and tucked it behind his ribs. The journey had already begun. The first thing he learned outside the train was that Siberian cold doesn't arrive. It exists. It doesn't move like weather. It waits like stone. When he breathed, his lungs burned as if filled with needles. The guards laughed, not out of cruelty, but the resignation of men who knew this place kills everyone the same, no matter the uniform. The camp sprawled across the snow like a wound. Barracks made from logs, roofs sunk under ice, smoke that barely lifted. Every morning the siren wailed, and shapes of men stumbled into the dawn. They carried axes, saws, and shovels, their breath fogging into clouds that looked like ghosts of the ones who hadn't made it through the night. Eric had stopped counting how many collapsed in the snow before the overseer barked, "Odstavit!" Leave them. There was no time to bury anyone until spring, and spring rarely came. The work was endless. They felled trees until their hands split open. They dug ditches through frozen earth so hard that picks sparked on rock. They hauled logs with ropes that ate through their shoulders until the skin hardened into scars. He didn't know what the Soviets were building. Maybe a railway, maybe nothing at all. In Siberia, the purpose was survival, not progress. Food was the rhythm of life. A ladle of soup, a handful of black bread, a pinch of salt if you were lucky. Men licked their bowls clean and scraped the frost off the edges, pretending it was sugar. Hunger changed the mind first, made it sharper, crueler. He'd seen men steal from friends, then cry afterward. Once, he found himself staring at a rat near the stove and thinking, meat. And yet, humanity never vanished completely. A Polish doctor traded his own bread for bandages. A Russian guard tossed a potato through the fence when no one was looking. The same hands that hit could also give. Eric began to understand that the enemy wasn't always a man in a different uniform. Sometimes the enemy was the cold itself, invisible, patient, undefeated. At night, when the wind howled across the steppe, they told stories to stay sane. One man described Berlin: lights, cafes, women in red coats, until it felt like a dream no one could afford to remember. Another whispered prayers in a language no one else knew. Eric said little. He just stared at the rafters and imagined the sound of rain on a roof. Any roof, instead of snow against wood. Time became circular. The same days repeated, only the faces changed. Men arrived, worked, disappeared. The guards stopped shouting names and used numbers instead. Disease came in waves: typhus, frostbite, dysentery, and left behind silence. When the spring thaw came, the dead were hauled to a pit behind the camp. Eric helped once. He remembered the weight, lighter than he expected. He marked time not by seasons, but by the things that broke: a shovel handle, a bone, a man's will. He had stopped dreaming until one morning a guard handed him an envelope, thin and soft like old cloth, a letter from home. His hands shook. The words were simple, written in his mother's careful hand. The garden has grown again. Your brother did not come home. Come before the trees bloom. It wasn't hope that filled him. It was command. A new kind of order, the only one that made sense. He read it again under his blanket, tracing each line with his finger. The next day, he began memorizing the guards' routes, the times the dogs slept, the path the supply sleds took. He started pocketing bits of bread, hiding them inside the straw mattress. He spoke less, worked harder, and watched everything. Every night before sleep, he unfolded the letter and read the final line. Come home before the trees bloom. He would, even if he had to walk through the entire frozen heart of the world to do it. There was no plan, only instinct and timing. Eric had watched the guards for months, when they smoked, when the dogs slept, when the snow covered footprints faster than eyes could find them. The perfect night came in February. A storm raged, thick, silent, endless white. When the camp fell into darkness, he wrapped his legs in torn blankets, slipped a stolen knife into his boot, and hid the letter against his chest. Outside, the world was nothing but snow and breath. He crept along the barracks, every crunch of ice sounding like a gunshot. At the fence, he dropped to his knees. The wire was brittle from frost. He worked fast, sawing with a shard of metal. One strand snapped, then another. He slid under, the steel tearing his coat and skin, and ran. Running in snow isn't running. It's falling forward again and again. He didn't stop for hours. Behind him, the camp. Ahead, a continent. He followed a frozen river because rivers always lead somewhere. At dawn, he hid beneath fallen trees, gasping, hands blue. He rubbed his feet with snow to wake the pain. Proof of life. He chewed frozen bread like stone, then slept, knife in hand. When he woke, the silence was absolute. No voices, no dogs, no world. Only wind. He began to walk west, always west, toward the idea of home. Days blurred. One bite of bread for sunrise, one for sunset. He melted snow to drink. He passed abandoned logging camps, chimneys black, tools rusting into the snow. Once, he found a frozen horse still harnessed to its sled. He took its blanket and whispered thanks. Nights were worse. The cold pressed from every side, whispering, "Lie down." He'd seen men do that once, just rest a moment, and never wake again. So he talked to himself, to the letter under his coat, to the ghosts of the barracks. He said their names. He said his own, again and again, until he believed it still meant something. On the 10th day he saw smoke, a village, wooden roofs, crooked fences, a dog barking. He couldn't approach in uniform. He hid until dark, then slipped into a barn, collapsing in hay that smelled like life. In the morning, an old Russian farmer found him. They stared at each other, one starving, one tired. Eric whispered, "Ich bin kein Feind. I'm not your enemy." The old man said nothing. He just handed him bread and pointed west. That was enough. That silent mercy meant more than escape itself, because it proved the world wasn't entirely cruel. And the road home was real. The world after the camp wasn't freedom. It was a test. Every mile west was a question. How much can a man lose and still keep walking? Eric followed the river whenever he could. It was his compass, his road, his hope. By day, the snow blinded him. By night, the stars were so sharp they looked like they could cut skin. His boots, already ruined, filled with ice. Every step tore at his feet. But he kept going, because stopping meant dying. Sometimes he saw distant smoke and went around it. Villages, maybe patrols. He'd rather starve than be sent back. He lived on what the forest gave: frozen berries, bark, snowmelt, and sometimes luck. Once he found a trap line, the string still warm, and stole a rabbit. He cooked it under a fallen tree, the smell almost making him cry. He hadn't tasted meat in months. But hunger was easier than loneliness. The silence became heavy, like a second body he carried on his shoulders. He started talking to the letter again, whispering to it as if his mother could somehow hear across the world. "I'm coming home," he said, into the wind. "You told me before the trees bloom. I will." One day, he reached a frozen village, a handful of wooden huts half buried in snow. He waited until dark, then approached a house with light inside. He knocked once and nearly collapsed when the door opened. A woman in a headscarf looked at him, the gaunt face, the uniform hanging like rags. She didn't ask questions. She just said, "Ticho," and pulled him in. She gave him soup, thin but warm. The salt made him tremble. Her husband stared, silent, then tossed him a pair of old felt boots. "West," the man said, pointing. "Go west." He stayed that night by their stove, pretending to sleep while they whispered. "He's one of them. He's just a boy. If they find out—" He closed his eyes. Gratitude and guilt felt the same. At dawn, he left before they woke. He didn't want them punished for mercy. The land changed. The endless white became forest, then frozen swamp. He crossed rivers on cracking ice, crawled through pine roots to stay hidden. Sometimes he saw Soviet convoys on the horizon, endless trucks rumbling through snow, and he would bury himself under branches until the sound faded. He met others too, shadows of men walking the same direction, Poles, Hungarians, even Russians who'd escaped their own camps. No one trusted anyone. They shared silence, not names. But one of them, a Czech named Marek, gave him half a crust of bread. "So you remember people exist," he said. They walked together for a week before Marek's leg gave out from frostbite. Eric begged him to keep moving. Marek smiled, handed him the last piece of bread and said, "You'll make it farther if you stop looking back." Then he lay down under the trees. Eric walked on. He didn't look back. Weeks blurred into one endless day. His beard grew wild, his coat stiff with sweat and snow. He didn't count time anymore. Only rivers crossed. Sometimes he imagined hearing music, bells, laughter, the click of train wheels, then realized it was the wind or his mind fracturing to stay alive. He knew he was close when the sky began to look different. The snow turned to mud. The air grew softer. He smelled pine, then smoke that didn't freeze in the air. And one morning, he saw it. A road, real and black against the white. A sign by the roadside said, Omsk, 32 kilometers. It might as well have said, civilization. He fell to his knees and laughed until he coughed blood. The wind didn't answer. But for the first time, it didn't feel like an enemy. By the time Eric reached Europe, he no longer looked like a soldier. His uniform was a patchwork of cloth and rope, his boots split open, his body nothing but bone and stubbornness. He didn't walk anymore. He moved, one step at a time, as if pulled by an invisible thread. That thread was home. He crossed into Poland under a night sky that smelled of smoke and damp wood. No border, no guards, just broken signs and burned villages. The war had ended years ago, but its shadow still lay over everything. Ruins, faces wary of strangers, towns where nobody asked names. Everywhere he went there were people like him, lost between countries, ghosts searching for a life that might not exist anymore. Once, he traded his knife for a ride on a farmer's wagon. The man looked him over and said, "You came from the east?" Eric nodded. The farmer spat on the ground. "Then you've already seen hell. Nothing worse waits ahead." They rode together in silence through fields still littered with helmets and bones. In one village, he found a church that had been turned into a shelter. Inside, dozens of refugees huddled by candlelight. Mothers, children, old men. Someone played a violin, the melody trembling through the cold air. Eric stood in the doorway, unable to move. It was the first music he had heard in years. He felt it like pain, sharp and real. A nun approached him, offered soup. "Where are you going?" she asked. "Home," he said. She gave a sad smile. "Then you're one of the lucky ones." He walked west for months, through the ruins of Warsaw, where streets were nothing but bricks and silence, through forests where the trees still hid shrapnel, through towns where the flags had changed but the fear hadn't. Sometimes he worked for food, chopping wood, digging graves, fixing roofs. He learned new words, forgot old ones. Each night, he slept closer to the idea of Germany, but farther from the man who had left it. In Czechoslovakia, a group of villagers stopped him. They saw the tattered uniform and froze. One of them, a young man, said, "You're one of them." Eric didn't deny it. He just said, "Not anymore." The man stared at him, then threw a loaf of bread at his feet. "Go, before someone less forgiving sees you." Eric nodded, picked it up, and walked away without a word. He had long stopped trying to defend himself. Survival was its own confession. Weeks later, the landscape began to feel familiar. The forests looked like the ones he had grown up near. The soil smelled like home after rain. He reached the Elbe River, the line that once divided armies. On the opposite bank, a new Germany waited, rebuilt, scarred, unrecognizable. He sat by the river all night, staring at the water. He could cross, but part of him feared what waited there. Not soldiers, not guards, emptiness. What if there was nothing left for him to return to? No house, no family, no reason for all the miles. At dawn, he stood, took the letter from his coat, the one he had carried for thousands of kilometers, and read it again, the paper now soft as cloth. "Come before the trees bloom." He smiled. He stepped into the river. The water was freezing but not deadly. He walked through it slowly, the current pushing against his knees. Every step felt lighter. He reached the far side, stumbled onto the bank, and fell to his knees, gasping. Not from exhaustion, but disbelief. He was home. When Eric reached his village, he almost walked past it. The road was different, lined with trees he didn't remember. The fields were smaller, the houses rebuilt from gray stone. Even the air smelled different, less like bread, more like smoke and machinery. He stood on the hill above it, staring down like a ghost watching his own life. He had imagined this moment 1,000 times during the march, but reality didn't fit any version of his dreams. There was no music, no welcome, no sign that time had waited for him. He walked slowly through the streets. Children played by the fountain. None of them looked up. Women carried laundry, talking softly in voices that sounded both familiar and strange. A man in uniform passed him and nodded politely, not recognizing the eyes of someone who had once worn the same kind of coat. The house was still there, smaller than he remembered, with ivy climbing the walls. He stood at the gate for a long time before knocking. An old woman opened the door, frail but upright. "Ja?" she said, squinting at him. He opened his mouth, but no sound came. Then, quietly, "Mutter." For a moment, she didn't move. Then her hand rose to her mouth, trembling. She reached out, touched his face, the beard, the hollow cheeks, the scar near his eye. "Erich?" He nodded. She fell against him, crying without sound. He felt her heartbeat, fast, alive. And it was the first warmth he had felt in years. Inside, the house was neat, quiet. There were new pictures on the wall, faces he didn't know. A small radio hummed softly with a post-war broadcast, the kind that spoke of rebuilding and moving on. His mother brought him bread and milk. He stared at the food for a long time before eating. "I thought you were gone," she said. "They told us everyone in Siberia was." "I was," he whispered. And it was true. Part of him had died there. She showed him a box with his brother's medals. "He never came back," she said. Eric nodded, his throat closing. Days passed like fog. He walked the village roads, visited the churchyard, helped repair fences. But he didn't speak much. People greeted him kindly, but they didn't know what to say. To them, the war was over. To him, it never would be. At night, he woke sweating, hearing the crunch of snow, the cry of the wind through pine. He would sit by the window until dawn, holding the letter that had brought him home. It was worn, almost unreadable now. But he didn't need the words anymore. He knew them by heart. "Come before the trees bloom." When spring finally came, he went to the hill above the village again. The trees were covered in soft white blossoms. He stood there for a long time, breathing in the scent of the new season, one he had fought to see. He thought of the men who hadn't made it, of the guard who threw him a potato, the farmer who gave him bread, the Czech who smiled before dying in the snow. He thought of the millions still walking in silence, trying to find their way back to something that might never exist again. He closed his eyes. For the first time, he didn't feel cold. He whispered to no one and to everyone, "I made it home." Then he turned and walked back down the hill, not as a soldier, not as a prisoner, but as a man who had finally survived the war.